Hi, Team America. I'm Terry Fox. I'm your host of Mind War podcast. I wanted to present with you a few frameworks in thinking about human needs. Why do I want to talk about this? Well, because we're in this very politically charged, obviously, but also interesting and shifting moment in time. We have a lot of people who are asking the same questions. I don't know about your audience of who you follow in social media, but I know from my point of view, there seems to be a lot of commonalities and a lot of like kind of basic core understanding at this point, which is really welcome to see. So I thought it might be helpful to provide some frameworks in how you might think about it, particularly if you're someone who works with groups or have some sort of influence over the development of people or young people, particularly maybe even young men, because I have an interesting theory to share with you. Okay, so I wanted to first kind of present what am I talking about when I say human needs? I think a lot of you may already be familiar with the idea or the concept of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You might remember that from college or maybe even high school. But essentially, if you recall, it is that pyramid, and he essentially says that you work from the base up, that if your physiological needs, like if you don't have food, you're not really going to be that as concerned about your safety, right? So if people do much more riskier things when they don't have access to food, for example, right? So your physiological needs are at the base of the pyramids, and then your safety, which might include psychological safety, belonging, then esteem, and then self-actualization. And in his framework, he's like, you don't achieve one until you achieve the base of the pyramid. You work your way up. And this kind of provides you with a framework of like, how are people motivated? That's usually what it's used in. But it provides like, sort of that structure that gives you a sense of like, well, what might be relevant in political culture, or what might be if the majority of the masses are operating based on those physiological and those safety needs, then things like self-actualization might be for a smaller population, for example. So you would utilize that information with your audience based on where you think that their needs are, right? Okay, so that's one framework that I think is like a good foundation and is really useful for, really anyone, again, especially leaders. Okay, so let's layer on another type of needs framework. This is the work of John Burton, and his is human needs theory. And his framework essentially came out of really protracted social conflicts of the 70s and 80s. And he basically, he kind of refines this, and he says that not only some needs, not just like preferred outcomes, but these are like fundamental basic human needs, and they're not negotiable. So what would that mean? Like if we were to apply that to Maslow's hierarchy, should we say, then those physiological and those safety needs, those things are not really negotiable. And you could even argue that belonging too might be one that's not really negotiable. But we'll get into that in a minute. However, when we're looking at Burton, we're saying he's saying that you really can't negotiate away certain basic needs, because in essence that would be, if you are applying this to a negotiation, should I say, those things would be almost bad faith. Why? Because no one would willingly negotiate away their basic human rights in a sustainable way. Why would you ever do that? Someone should be always aspiring to achieve fundamental basic human rights, and the more that they're challenged, the more it's going to draw into a protracted disagreement, because they are fundamental human rights and they're not negotiable. So Burton's work is really important because he's saying that there's these sort of underlying needs that are existential. So, you know, if those are being threatened, those basic human needs are being threatened, then that would be considered an existential crisis. Okay? And that type of conflict is more likely to be protracted. Okay? That makes sense, right? So again, it kind of falls back into, yeah, it does align with Maslow. However, he's saying, yeah, you can't even, they may build on a pyramid, but you can't actually ever get to the top unless, like, these things, you can't even negotiate them away. Like, there's no point in even trying, because to do so is actually just a waste of everyone's time. And if anyone knows me, I'm all about efficiency. So if I'm talking, you know, I'm providing you with some suggestions or some advice on how you're working with group dynamics and conflict, then I would say, hey, you might want to recognize that some of these needs are not and should not be negotiated away, because they will be inherently bad faith. It would be inherently a bad faith negotiation. I don't know. That's just that's not really necessarily how Burton applied it, but that's how I think about it in this context. Okay. So all right, let's see. Oh, this is also another interesting part of Burton's work, is that Burton sort of puts it into these four different buckets, right? So there's identity, there's needs around identity, like who am I, right? And again, fundamental, everybody has to have a sense of who they are, right? That's not really something that should be removed from someone. That's an existential crisis, right? Recognition. Do others see me? People need to have recognition in their lives. When they are in patterns of behaviors where they feel unseen, that's unhealthy for them, right? Their needs aren't going to be met. They're not going to thrive. Security. Am I safe? It goes back to, again, that physical security and psychological security. That has to be met. If people are in environments that they feel psychologically unsafe, again, that's going to have consequences, right? Okay. And then participation. Do I have voice or agency over myself? Like, am I able to make decisions for myself in my best interest, or am I, having to supersede or allow someone else's needs to supersede mine? But Ross's book in Belonging, he talks a lot about identity, but he also talks about dignity, which is kind of something that I personally feel as though is really important, because we as a culture are the authority of dignity. What do I mean by that? I mean that dignity happens or it doesn't happen based on our collective behavior. That's how it's preserved, that's how it's honored, that's also how it's disgraced. So if we decide that we want to behave and treat each other with dignity, then we do that. And when we collectively decide to allow people to be treated without dignity, then again, I would argue that's a karmic decision, but it's also not something that few get to actually possess. So there isn't a tiny group of people that get to determine who is treated with dignity and not dignity. Why? Because the masses determine who has dignity and not dignity. Why? Because they're the masses. So if you have, like, a small population versus a large population, and some people say this should not be tolerated because it's indignified and it's not the way that humans should be treated, then that is sort of what should happen. It's really not up for debate, right? And when we're talking about basic human needs, again, those things shouldn't even be bothered to be negotiated away, because they're human needs, and that would always be in bad faith. Why would it ever not be? Because someone should not be if you're trying to remove someone's basic human rights, you are a bad faith negotiator, because you have no right to do that. Do you understand? So it just becomes a loop, or it becomes its own feedback loop, should we say, because there's just, that's where you have intractable conflicts that never end. It's because people's basic human rights are being targeted, which is frankly absurd, particularly absurd in a country like the United States, in which there's already been so much sacrifice for those rights to be in our Bill of Rights, in our Constitution, et cetera, right? Okay, but back to the righteous mind, really quick, and moral foundation. This is actually really important. So basically, in this book, he talks about a lot of things that I encourage you to, again, it's a interesting book, but particularly he talks about 6 moral foundations. And this, I think, is really important, because you know how sometimes we're like, oh, the political parties seem to be, you know, they seem to just not, they can never find common ground. Well, that's often because they literally have their understanding of morality is based on a different foundation. So in Hat's book, he talks about basically 6 moral foundations. So one of them would be care, and like your sort of nurturing, your protection, or what would that negatively look like? That would be like harm or cruelty, right? So there's somebody might be very heavily oriented towards care or inclusion, right? So that would obviously be something that would be dominated in the left, right? A lot of liberals over-index in that area where they want to care for a broad swath of different people. They want diversity. They want everyone, you know, equity and inclusion, right? These things should not be up for debate. Again, that's a basic human right, guys. It's an inherently flawed argument for you to try to withhold basic human rights from someone. It's just not something that they psychologically should ever accept. It just should not work that way. And people are not predispositioned whatsoever to accept that. Why would they? I would argue, if you're a power holder, you need to go step into the wherever and go look at yourself in the mirror and look at yourself in the eye and say, would I allow my basic human rights to be taken away from me by someone else? Okay, there you go. All right. So anyway, the foundation of, again, kind of that care, nurturing, protection, that might be one of the foundations. But then there's also fairness, which is like your sense of like justice, or your concern around exploitation or cheating, right? Your core concern is like, again, that equal treatment or reciprocity, right? Then another foundation is loyalty, commitment to the in-group, right? Group solidarity, sacrifice, authority would be the 4th one. So that idea of like tradition, what's sacred. The next one is sanctity, which is what's sacred. So purity, sanctity, religion, right? That's one of the 6 moral foundations that someone may, the protection of the sacred. And then liberty is the 6th one. So freedom and autonomy, resistance to domination, and a fear of like that oppression or coercion, right? So basically what he talks about is that where you are in your political spectrum, you may actually have those 6 buckets of moral foundation. You may check more of those or less of those depending on where you fall in the political spectrum. And that understanding of your moral foundation and what kind of is the core things that really, you know, set you apart in your values and how you tend to vote or purchase. Let's hope you're all shopping, like voting with your dollars every day at this point. If you're just blindly buying stuff and not thinking, being cognizant, I don't know what you're doing. But like all of those things are part of your moral foundation. And so again, helpful if you are dealing with people across political spectrums, being able to potentially even identifying, hey, what are these areas that you identify with in your moral foundation, right? Like, what do you, is liberty, is sanctity, is authority, is loyalty, is fairness, is care? Which is your most important thing? How would you rank that if you had to rank it? That would give someone some meaningful context when they're trying to have cross spectrum political conversations, if there are people who want to do that, right? I assume that there are at least some people in this world that want to do that. I don't know though. Some people, I think they thrive off of the division. So anyway, that's an idea as well that should be looked at. And again, it falls under in Howard Ross's book of basically the need for belonging, right? And how, again, your sense of belonging, your sense of having community, your sense of having family, whether that is chosen or blood, or legal, then it still gives you a place within the whole spectrum of life, right? And like where you fit in your home and your town and your city and your, or whatever, and then your broader community and your country and your, all these different ways in which we bucket our identities, right? So basically, in summary with Burton is saying that, interest can be negotiated, but needs cannot be negotiated, right? Needs need to be, acknowledged. They need to be addressed. They need to be honored. And basically, no matter what agreement is made, if needs are not being addressed, then it will not be resolved. Interests, on the other hand, those are things that can be negotiated. Those things aren't like critical to someone's survival or critical to their psychological foundation, right? Okay. Now, here's a couple of other lesser known theorists that I wanted to bring up, but Mark Howard Ross, I love, he has a book about belonging that is incredible, that I really think everyone should read. It's an incredible book. But basically he brings in a layer of psychocultural theory. And so basically he's saying that, the role of culture or of narrative, these like psychological interpretations shape how our conflict is experienced and also perpetuated. So what does that mean? He basically talks about things like that they're not simply like trying to achieve objectives. They're also about like how people are making meaning of their experiences, right? We have experiences, and that's not happening in a vacuum. We then process those and make meaning from them. And you can make conscious meaning, subconscious meaning, or both. You're probably doing both most of the time. But the point is that you interpret those experiences, and those interpretations are going to be, reflective of things like your history, your identity, threats to those identity, cultural anxieties, things like that, that are played out in in your present, likely because they're part of your past, right? Or part of your identity or part of your previous experiences, how you made meaning of those experiences, right? And so people become more resistant to conflict because they're kind of having like two layers of it. There's sort of the manifested level where there is policy and law that applies to people's experiences. But then there's also this sort of whose history is being honored, and what are the narratives that are being told about those histories? What are the stories that we tell ourselves around gender dynamics or race dynamics, right? And that those are all very relevant to how we make meaning of our belonging in society. And that if you don't have a sense of belonging, then it's almost like you don't have, I kind of think of like, you don't have a foundation of trust, right? Like, who do you trust then, right? That's terrible. And so that sort of, when you layer that in, that kind of becomes its own layer to conflict. And one element of his book that I thought was really great, he references another book, which I can't find the belonging book. I'll have to make note of it. But it's an incredible one. But this one, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, this is really a fantastic book. And this author, Jonathan Haidt, he says, basically, he provides a framework for moral foundation, which is actually pretty interesting in its own right. So the research is done, though, in the book specifically, it does say that liberals are more inclined towards the care and fairness, right? Which makes sense. A lot of the initiatives, that is what they lean towards, right? Whereas conservatives tend to be across all 6 of the buckets, and then depending where they are on that spectrum, that's where, they may fall into some buckets more heavily than the others. But it's interesting because that does show you, or at least certainly when this published, which was I think 2012, that the Conservative Party was rather fragmented in itself. It's like you might say, well, that's actually great that they're at least having fair representation in all of those areas, but that also tells you that it is a pretty fragmented group, and that you could easily kind of within 6 you could be splitting those off, and they could be splitting hairs depending on how that's divided up based on the actions of our current or historical conservative leaders, right? So is that going to shift where others see themselves because of the behaviors of what we see, and again, our current or historical political leaders? So something to think about anyway, right? So what, in essence they say is that these layers of narrative, history, collective memory really does lay a foundation for our political dialogue, and very important in how we approach it, because there are perceptions around, how people interpret these different areas of morality, especially things around religion, or the things that not only they believe are true, but also sacred, right? And what is that moral language around that? So those are kind of some interesting things to bring up, because it's really not like they're not failing to necessarily see what people across the political divide aren't necessarily failing to see what others see. They're just seeing something completely different. Their moral lens is like it's almost like a different prescription, if you will, right? They're looking at the world through different eyes because their lens of morality is just different. And that doesn't mean one is better than the other. It's just different. And that's where we need to stop trying to impose our will on each other, where we're crossing each other's boundaries around what we consider of being morality or identity or whatever. It's like we can coexist without being completely suffocating and imposing on one another. We should be able to. We've done it thus far. In many ways we've improved. No, we're not perfect. We have a lot of places to go, but we have been moving in that direction, right? So something, again, just kind of frameworks for understanding people's needs. If you're someone who is in the position of authority or influence, again, or work with groups, etc. Which brings me to my next subject or framework, which is hegemonic masculinity theory. I just recently had a conversation about someone, again, about this just like last week. And I really think that this is important to look into, particularly if you're someone that works with men's groups, particularly if you're someone who works with white men's groups even, because there is a gap there that I think we all need to change we our thinking, which we can get into in a second. But hegemonic masculinity theory is R.W. Connell's, and his basically it's a role of gender as a structuring force in political conflict. So it basically argues that in any society, there are forms of masculinity that are perceived to be dominant, or are dominant because of the perception within the society, and they achieve they're the power holders, if you will, within any given society, and it's not through force alone. It's actually through naturalization as being perceived as a legitimate, or what you're legitimate because you are what is perceived to be what men should be aspiring to, which is very interesting, right? So it's sort of this dominant template for masculinity, if you will, within any given culture. So in the United States, for example, the traits would be like, and obviously these would be based on, cultural norms. So this would differ in different countries, right, or different cultures. But in America, emotional stoicism, physical toughness, competitive dominance, heterosexual prowess, self-sufficiency, and that unambiguous authority, right? Those are traits, but they also can be further defined into, certain height, a number of kids, socioeconomic demographics, or actual like age demographics, hair color, thickness of hair, all this kind of stuff. These are all things that men are subconsciously or consciously ranking themselves against in all dynamics with other men in the room. So let's take a hypothetical. You go into a restaurant and you walk into the restaurant, and most people are at least somewhat conscious of how they feel in their own skin within that restaurant, right? If it's a sandwich place or something, then and it's casual, maybe there's a low threshold. It's not a big deal. But let's say it's a fancy place. Let's say it's a jacket place or something. Somebody might feel more self-conscious or less self-conscious depending on how normal that is for them, right? But let's take that and apply it to not just like the clothes, but actually the people in the room. So men, and I'm not saying women don't also do this, but we're talking, this is specifically, I want to talk about men, but that you're, again, ranking yourself against the other people in the room, whether you're aware of it or you're not. And how that affects you is that, it impacts the way that you perceive your power in that environment. So where, this becomes a real concern is that men become more rigid behaviorally when their perceptions around themselves are further challenged. So like, if the more insecure men feel against that conscious or unconscious ranking, the more rigid they will become around, like, perhaps maybe their more toxic traits, should I say, because it brings out their insecurity, okay? And so things like, economic dislocation, demographic changes, shifting gender norms, erosion of traditional male-female gender dynamics, all of these things have sort of challenged a lot of men in this area, and it's made them become more and more rigid in their own perception of masculinity, okay? And so, again, this isn't necessarily it's just information. It's just data and a framework for men to think about, because, and I would point it out specifically, they find in the research is that working class men specifically experiencing economic or cultural displacement, the loss of the masculine status is compounded by racial anxiety, it's compounded by class resentment, and so it really does create this volatility in men, particularly white men. And I would argue one of the reasons, I don't want to say it's the only reason because I'm sure there's many reasons, it depends on the audience, but one of the reasons could be because there really aren't a lot of norms around groups that target white men. I know that's a little controversial, right? Because historically, when we think of white men's groups, what would we think of? Yeah, they would have negative connotations. Fortunately, there are a lot of men's groups that seem to be popping up, and I mean, I don't know of any that are, I would hope, are not putting restrictions, because yes, when people start excluding anybody, that's messed up. You can't do that. That's where you start getting weird, and it's not healthy, and it could be it could be problematic, right? But like as a part of like a group's identity of being like, hey, we are white and we like our culture and we want to support it too, just like any other culture. I think that that's perfectly healthy, and I think we need to normalize that, right? As like people on the left end of the spectrum, we need to say, hey, we support healthy groups if it happens to be a lot of white men, because that's how it happens to turn out, because a community happens to be white dominant, then that's okay, and we don't necessarily have negative connotations towards them, right? I would hope that we wouldn't. We have to look at things a little deeper, right? If we're going to heal the country, we have to be able to chew gum and walk. I know some people say some cultures chewing gum's gross, so we come up with another analogy, I don't know. But you do have to be able to do more than one thing. You have to, I think if we want to really get through this in the most constructive way, we are going to have to recognize that there's perspective that we don't understand, that we don't know, of people across the aisle from us, and people in the middle, quite frankly, as well, but that most people want the best for the country, and most people are good people, right? Like, we have to assume good intentions, and at least be willing to hear people out. And I would encourage you, I know I personally had it made a really large impact on my life when I started just following people that were very different from me in social media. And it was because I was realizing that there was something I was clearly missing, and maybe there was insight there. And yeah, some of the people I still disagree with, and that's okay. But and people who are like super disrespectful, I mean, you have to draw the line somewhere. People need to be able to have, like, they need to be adults, right? But at the same time, it's okay to follow or listen to people who piss you off, as long as it's constructive, right? As long as they're being, like, the idea is that you have the self-awareness to say, yeah, that doesn't make me feel very good, but why does that not make me feel very good? Like, we need to start having these questions with ourselves, and the more we have these questions with ourselves, the easier it's going to be for us to have these questions with other people. Because if you can't answer them in yourself, you're probably not going to be able to have meaningful dialogue across the aisle. Okay? I don't know. So I guess, so then where does this sort of leave us with all of these? One is I think that it gives us some sort of, again, understanding of foundation. We need to build trust in this country. If we don't have trust, we don't have much. So almost every community should be trying to figure out ways in which they establish trust with as many people as possible in their community. And that takes good faith, that takes being open-minded, that takes being friendly, which, I have to say, that's always, I've moved a lot around the country over the years, over the years, and lived all over the country. And, there are definitely some communities that are more welcoming than other communities. There's always a mixed bag of like individuals, but from a community perspective, community actually does have a vibe. Your community has a vibe. So, I mean, what do you want that vibe to be? Maybe you want it to be one where people who are new don't feel very welcome, or maybe you want that to be one that they do. I don't know, but that's something that you certainly, it's a choice, right? We tend to go around reacting to what's happening to us when we have a lot of choices. We actually have a lot of agency still, and we should use that agency. We should not be just handing it over for convenience or for because we feel powerless. That's not a reason to do anything. We need to be like very cognizant of the communities that we're building. We need to be cognizant of that people's needs, basic needs, are being met, and that they're getting them, that it's met in a dignified way, because it's just the conduct in some of the footage that is circling the world right now of the way people are being treated without dignity. I'm going to tell you something. Sorry. I don't like killing things, but it was biting me. There's footage going around the world, and I'm not going to say who, what, where, when, why, and how. We all know. But I want to point out that in no narrative of any heroic story ever that anyone knows of, and if you think of one, by all means share it with the world, because we'd all love to know. There are not stories out there where heroes are the ones terrorizing everyone. That's not a thing. That's not a thing. I know that we think that, like, we have the anti-heroes, like the Dexters or something of the world, but like, come on. We've got to stop the madness, and we have to start with like having real conversations with people's needs, and acknowledging that, hey, we are different. We have gender differences. We have race differences. We should not be trying to ignore those. It's part of our culture, and we kind of need to have like cultural permission to say, hey, these are things, because if we don't identify them, how do we expect people to disengage from it? If we ignore that there are, again, these kind of unspoken, there's this unspoken ranking that men do, and we ignore that, and then we have kids that are going and hurting kids at schools and stuff. I mean, it's sort of information that we're missing. That's a framework that we should probably be looking at when we're talking about school incidences. Hegemonic masculinity theory. How are these kids feeling in relationship to the other kids in their classes or in their school? And do they feel like they have any sort of support network, right? Because that is part of that transformation within these specific groups. And I think that we've all sort of identified that, yeah, white men, we just had them disgracefully at our Capitol on the 4th. And again, I would argue, instead of getting angry, what we need is we need to have the good men meeting them there and having an intervention. Those young men that showed up with masks on their faces in DC need an intervention with like good, intelligent, like honorable men who like can share knowledge with them, can share experiences with them, and help them achieve the safety that they are looking for, recognition that they're looking for, the sense of dignity that they're looking for, that everyone else is looking for. Right? These are things that we all want, and no one should be excluded from it, because when they're excluded from it, then they then become a problematic class. That's where we are. So we need to move out of that, right? That's the objective, is to move out of that. And we need to understand that these things aren't going to be, it's not going, the goal isn't to like eliminate it entirely. It's like, we can't eliminate conflict entirely. We shouldn't even try conflict. The idea of conflict being, most people are terrified of conflict. That's a whole other thing. We're going to have a whole other thing about that. Most people are terrified of conflict, and they will do anything to avoid conflict. Here's the thing though, nothing has ever happened in progress without conflict. It's the engine, and it is absolutely the engine of democratic life. And the difference is to make sure that it is transformed into constructive conflict and not destructive conflict, right? And we have been in patterns of destructive conflict, but we have absolutely entered into constructive conflict paradigms, because there are so many people on the left and the right. I don't know who you follow. Again, I don't know who you follow, but I'm going to tell you what, the people I follow, they are all saying the same thing. I mean, not all saying the same thing, but like, I honestly, in some of the times, I have no idea like where someone even falls anymore, because I'm just like, yeah, I mean, we're all just sort of like, what are the power holders doing? What are we doing here? Like, what are we doing here? This is not how this is not how things should work. So there's a story that I'm going to finish with, that if you don't know this story, I would love you to, especially if you have young kids at home, go get it. It's a great story. And I think it might even be in the same book as the Lime Green Pants with Nobody Inside Them, which is actually really good too. We'll talk about that some other day. I love children's books. The Plain Belly Sneetches and the Star Bellied Sneetches. So from Dr. Seuss, some of you might remember, there's a story about the star-bellied Sneetches and the plain-bellied Sneetches. And the star-bellied Sneetches had stars on their stomach, and they thought they were better than the plain-bellied Sneetches, and they would walk around with their noses in the air, and they wouldn't allow the plain-bellied Sneetches to go to their barbecues, and they were not nice, and they made the plain-bellied Sneetches felt bad in the presence of the star-bellied Sneetches. And until one day, a man arrives, and I can't remember, it was something Mick Sylvester, something or another, but I like to call him the Onceler, because he reminds me of the Onceler from the Lorax. But he comes along and says, oh, here, I have this machine, I can build you this machine, and I can put stars on your belly. And so the plain-bellied Sneetches all start going through the machine and have the stars put on their belly, and then they show up at the barbecues and they say, hey, we're here, look, we're just like you. And this causes the original star-bellied Sneetches to be horrified or something. And so again, we're going to call him the Onceler. That's not his name, but that's what we're going to call him right now. The Onceler says, oh, look what I can do. I can put this machine in reverse. and I can remove the stars. So the people, the star-bellied Sneetches go back and they have the stars removed. And so this carries us or creates a sequence of events where they just go in and out and in and out, in and out and in and out in the machine. And they're spending more and more and more money to have them put on, removed, put on, removed, put on, removed, until eventually they run out of money entirely. And nobody knows who what was. And basically the guy just kind of drives off with all their money. And, you know, they end up becoming, you know, friends in the end, because they really can't determine who was what. They're all sort of just a mix now, which is a really great story. And a good cautionary tale to be careful to alter yourself too much to suit, you know, some insecurity, right? But there's also kind of a, I don't know, what if the plain belly Sneetches would have just taken all that money and figured out, like, had their own barbecue? Or why didn't they just do something else to elevate themselves, to make themselves feel better? Because why would they even care about these poor character star-belly Sneetches? Because quite frankly, if they're walking around with their stars on their belly, with their nose in the air, and you can't do this, why is anyone following them? That's the question. That's the moral of the story in my eyes. Why was anyone even following them? Who cares if they had stars on their belly? They're not of good character. Why are we following people with poor character? Because they have money, or because they get their faces altered, or they get whatever? Like, again, to each their own. I don't really care about that so much as I care about young people being raised without understanding what's real anymore. They're on the tech all the time. They are, you know, disconnected from nature. The ADHD is terrible. I would argue a lot of this stuff is probably designed to cause ADHD. And, you know, people with ADHD, yeah, I would imagine you're probably a little bit easier to get to in certain ways. Although I would say maybe, I don't know. I think that's up for debate. But there are certainly people who would try to manipulate it. So my question is, like, if we want to, it's not my question, it's more of a statement. If we want to get anywhere in this society, and we want to get anywhere with conflict, we need to understand that there are frameworks of needs. People have certain fundamental needs that they deserve, and they cannot negotiate away in good faith. You can trick them, but what does that say about you? And if that's what you're doing, be prepared for there to be karmic consequences for you. Again, you can do whatever you want in this realm except hurt other people. When you start hurting other people, then you start getting lines on your notches on your belt of bullshit that you're going to have to pay for eventually. So I'm just not sure what everyone's doing. Why is everyone so hell-bent on creating a shitty world where they are just obsessed with themselves every second of the day? Like, where is the giving? Because there's definitely givers, but man, there are just takers and takers and takers and takers. And it's just getting to the point where it's shameful. I don't know. I'm just... Keto? I don't know. It's time. But anyway, I hope that some of that was helpful for you. I actually do have a document that I kind of put together that I can link or something. I can figure out how to do that. If anyone wants to have it for reference, so that they could, if they're, you know, if they're working with anybody, or alternately, if people have any thoughts about, hey, I'd like to hear more about Maslow's hierarchy needs. I'd like to hear more about human needs theory. I'd like to hear more about Ross's theories around belonging, or about moral foundations, or about hegemonic masculinity theory. Those are the major ones that we touched on. So if there's something that you want to hear more about, by all means, let me know. I'm happy to do a deeper dive in those individual ones. But I thought it would be a good foundation. And I think, you know, we'll have some other conversations around foundational understandings. But if there's something that you do want me to talk about more, or bring more information to the table, by all means, let me know. I'm happy to provide like resources too. I want this to be a learning experience for people that actually want to use it, versus it just be me talking and nobody actually uses the information. The whole point is that you take it and you use it and you apply it to like, you know, change the world, people. That's what we're doing. That's what we're here to do, right? I have knowledge, you have people. Well, if we're smart, we'll get it together, right? Anyway, more to come on a bunch of other stuff, but I thought this was important to talk about, given everything going on. Anyway, love you all. You all are awesome. Love you. Bye.